Tonight, the world woke up to a frightening possibility, a major war in the Middle East that could shake the entire global economy, and the reason is simple: oil. The fuel that powers cars, planes, factories, and entire countries suddenly became a weapon in a fast-growing conflict between the United States, Israel, and Iran. Within days, missiles, airstrikes, and naval threats pushed oil prices above $100 per barrel, and governments everywhere began preparing for an energy shock that could hit every household on Earth. So what exactly happened, and why does this crisis matter to ordinary people? What happened next moved incredibly fast. In late February 2026, tensions that had been building for years exploded. After negotiations between Washington and Tehran collapsed the United States, and Israel launched a massive coordinated wave of airstrikes against Iranian military sites, missile bases, air defenses, and nuclear facilities. Reports say nearly 900 strikes happened in just 12 hours. That scale shocked even experienced analysts. Iran's leadership suffered devastating losses, including Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. According to reports, Washington described the attacks as a preemptive move meant to remove nuclear threats and weaken Iran's regional influence immediately. But Iran did not stay silent. Within days, it responded using missiles, drones, and naval tactics designed to disrupt global energy flows. One of the most dramatic moves was the effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. Around 20% of the world's seaborne oil normally passes through this corridor every single day. When mines, missiles, and military threats stopped, tanker traffic, global markets panicked almost instantly. Oil traders realized that millions of barrels per day might disappear from world supply almost overnight. That fear alone sent prices skyrocketing across energy. Markets within hours. Before the conflict, Brent crude traded around $72 per barrel. By the 7th and 8th of March, prices briefly surged to nearly $120, a jump of more than 60% in only days. Imagine gasoline, food, transport, and airline costs, all rising at the same time. That is why leaders from the world's richest democracies reacted quickly. On March 9th, finance ministers from the Group of 7 nations held an emergency virtual meeting. Their goal was simple: prevent a full-scale global energy panic. But could releasing emergency oil reserves calm markets? To understand that decision, we need to step back for a moment. The Group of 7, often called the G7, includes the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Italy, Japan, and Canada. These countries together represent a huge share of the world economy. When crises threaten global markets, they sometimes coordinate emergency actions. One of their most powerful tools is something called strategic petroleum reserves. Think of these as giant underground emergency tanks filled with oil, saved for extreme situations. The International Energy Agency coordinates how countries use these reserves, but should they open them now because of this war? That was the question dominating the March 9th meeting. Some governments, especially the United States, supported a large coordinated release of 300 to 400 million barrels of oil. That amount equals several days of total global demand. The idea is simple. If markets suddenly see huge extra supply, prices may fall quickly, and panic could calm. Other countries, however, were more cautious. Germany and Japan worried about using too much emergency stock too early. What if the war lasts longer than expected? After hours of discussion, the group signaled readiness to act but did not release. Oil immediately, interestingly, that signal alone helped calm markets. When traders heard that the G7 stood ready to act, oil prices pulled back sharply. By the end of March 9th, Brent crude had fallen to about $99.50 per barrel. That drop showed something important. Energy markets are driven not only by supply, but also by expectations. If investors believe governments will intervene, panic can fade quickly. Yet the situation remained extremely fragile because the real problem had not disappeared. The Strait of Hormuz was still effectively blocked. So the big question became, how long? Can this crisis last? To answer that, we need to understand why the Strait of Hormuz matters so much. Imagine the global oil system as a network of highways, moving energy from producers to consumers. The Strait of Hormuz is like a narrow bridge that many of those highways must cross. Every day, about 21 million barrels of oil normally travel through this passage, mostly from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates. When ships cannot pass, the world suddenly loses access to a huge portion of supply. That is why even a temporary closure terrifies markets. But the oil shock is only part of the story. Behind it lies decades of rivalry, mistrust, and failed diplomacy between Iran, Israel, and the United States. Israel sees Iran's nuclear program as an existential threat, meaning a danger to its survival. Iranian leaders argue their program is peaceful, but Western governments fear it could produce nuclear weapons. Over the years, tensions produced cyber attacks, sanctions, proxy wars, and covert operations. The strikes in February 2026 were therefore not a sudden accident. They were the dramatic explosion of pressure that had been building for many years. Could diplomacy have stopped this escalation? That remains one of the most important questions. Just days before the war began, negotiators from Iran and the United States met through mediators in Oman, trying to revive talks about sanctions relief and nuclear limits. Those negotiations collapsed on February 26th. Each side blamed the other for bad faith. When diplomacy fails, military options often move forward quickly. Soon after the talks broke down the joint, American-Israeli strikes began. Analysts say both governments believed waiting longer could allow Iran to strengthen its defenses, but that calculation also triggered the regional war we see today. Now, the geopolitical goals of each side are becoming clearer. The United States and Israel say their objective is to dismantle Iran's nuclear capabilities and weaken the network of armed groups it supports across the Middle East, including Hezbollah and the Houthis. From their perspective, the strikes are meant to prevent future threats. Iran, however, sees the attacks very differently. Its leaders describe the conflict as an existential battle against foreign aggression. Because Iran cannot easily defeat the United States militarily, it focuses on asymmetric strategies, disrupting shipping, targeting regional bases, and threatening global energy supplies. This approach raises another critical question. Could the conflict spread further across the region? Already missiles and drones have targeted American bases in Iraq and energy infrastructure in Saudi Arabia. Kuwait even cut oil production temporarily because of spillover risks. Meanwhile, shipping companies are rerouting tankers around dangerous waters, adding weeks to delivery times and increasing transport costs. If more countries become involved, the disruption could grow dramatically. That possibility is exactly why global leaders are watching every development hour by hour. Another escalation could push oil prices far beyond $100, but could they actually reach $200 as Iranian officials warned? Some analysts believe that scenario is possible if the Strait of Hormuz remains blocked for many weeks. Remember, about 1/5 of the world's seaborne oil moves through that narrow waterway? Losing that supply for long would force countries to compete fiercely for remaining barrels. Prices could surge toward $150 or even higher. That kind of spike would hit consumers everywhere, from Europe to India to Japan. Higher energy costs often lead to inflation, slower growth, and sometimes recession. The International Monetary Fund already warns global output could fall if energy shocks continue. So what options exist? To prevent that outcome, the most immediate tool remains the strategic petroleum reserves we discussed earlier. The International Energy Agency coordinates these emergency stockpiles created after the 1974 oil crisis, triggered by an Arab embargo. Since then, the system has been used only a few times, including during the Ukraine war in 2022, when the United States released 180 million barrels that year. Prices dropped roughly 10% within weeks. Supporters of another release argue it could again cool markets quickly. Critics worry reserves are limited and meant for extreme emergencies. Is this moment already extreme enough? That debate explains why the March 9th meeting ended without an immediate decision. Leaders wanted more information about how the war might evolve. The next discussion among G7 energy ministers occurred on March 10th, while fighting continued in the region. Markets watched every headline closely because even small signals from governments can move prices dramatically. Investors also looked for clues from OPEC, plus the alliance of major oil producers. But so far, additional supply promises have struggled with logistical limits. That means uncertainty remains high, which leads to the biggest question of all: what happens next? Several possible scenarios are now being discussed by analysts worldwide. The first is a short conflict lasting only a few weeks. If military operations quickly damage Iran's capabilities and tanker routes reopen, oil flows could normalize relatively fast. In that case, prices might settle somewhere between $80 and $90 per barrel, especially if emergency reserves are released. A second scenario is a longer grinding confrontation where Hormuz stays dangerous and shipping remains limited, that would likely push prices above $150 and strain global economies. A third possibility is regional escalation involving more countries. Which path will the world take? That may depend on decisions made in the coming days, especially regarding energy policy. If the G7 coordinates a large release of reserves, markets could receive an immediate signal that governments will defend supply stability. On the other hand, if leaders hesitate too long, traders might interpret that caution as weakness, triggering new price spikes. Another factor is how Iran chooses to respond. If it intensifies attacks on shipping lanes or regional infrastructure, the crisis could deepen quickly, but if back-channel diplomacy reappears, tensions might slowly cool. The situation therefore remains fluid, unpredictable, and extremely sensitive. Beyond immediate prices, this crisis also reveals a deeper truth about modern geopolitics. Energy remains one of the most powerful tools in international politics. Countries may talk about technology and digital economies, yet oil and gas still power transport industry and electricity. When supply is threatened, entire economies tremble. That is why conflicts in the Middle East often ripple across the entire planet, from Asian factories to European heating bills to American gasoline prices. Some experts believe crises like this could accelerate investment in renewable energy as countries try to reduce dependence on unstable supply routes, but that transition takes time, and the world still depends heavily on oil today. For now, families, businesses, and governments everywhere are watching the Middle East, closely wondering how far this confrontation might go. Will emergency reserves stabilize markets? Will shipping through the Strait of Hormuz reopen quickly? Or could a longer conflict reshape the global energy map in ways we have not yet imagined? One thing is already clear. A regional war has become a global economic story because oil connects every nation. The next moves by leaders and markets will determine whether this crisis fades or grows into something far bigger. In the end, the most important lesson may be how quickly geopolitics can reach into everyday life. A decision made in a war room thousands of kilometers away can change the price of fuel, food, transport, and electricity across the world. The United States, Israel, and Iran are fighting for security power and influence, but the consequences spread far beyond the battlefield. That is why leaders from the G7 are racing to prevent an energy shock that could slow the entire global economy. The coming weeks will reveal whether diplomacy, markets, and emergency reserves can contain the crisis, or another escalation will push the conflict into even more dangerous territory. For viewers trying to understand the stakes, remember this simple idea: energy is the lifeblood of modern civilization. When that lifeblood is threatened, politics, economics, and security suddenly collide. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz shows how one narrow waterway can influence the entire planet. Ships carrying oil normally pass there every hour, feeding refineries, power plants, and transport networks across continents. When those ships stop moving, uncertainty spreads instantly through financial markets, government meetings, and family budgets. That is why the world is watching this crisis so closely. Yet another layer of uncertainty comes from information itself. In wars, accurate details are often difficult to verify. Governments release statements that support their own narratives, while independent observers struggle to confirm events on the ground. Casualty numbers, for example, remain unclear. Reports from different sides vary widely, making it difficult to know the true human cost of the strikes and retaliations. What is clearer, however, is the scale of economic disruption. Oil markets respond not only to confirmed losses, but also to fear and expectation. When traders imagine future shortages, they bid prices higher immediately. Could calmer signals from diplomacy reverse that psychology? History suggests they might. During previous energy crises, coordinated government action sometimes reassured markets enough to stop panic. That is exactly what the International Energy Agency was designed to achieve after the 1974 oil embargo forced Western economies into turmoil. Member countries promised to hold emergency reserves equal to about 90 days of imports. The idea was simple solidarity. If supply shocks occur, nations can release oil together, preventing any single country from facing the crisis alone. Today's discussion about 300 to 400 million barrels follows that same principle: cooperation. But cooperation can be politically complicated. Each country has its own economic pressures and energy needs. Import-dependent nations like Japan worry deeply about supply shortages, while producers sometimes benefit from higher prices. Domestic politics also shape decisions. Leaders must explain to voters why national reserves built for emergencies are being used during foreign conflicts. These debates often slow decision-making, even when markets demand rapid action. The tension between urgency and caution was visible during the recent G7 meetings. Some ministers argued immediate intervention was necessary. Others preferred waiting for clearer battlefield developments. The balance between those views remains uncertain. Meanwhile, financial markets around the world continue reacting minute by minute. Stock indexes initially dipped when oil surged because higher energy costs can reduce company profits. Later, many markets recovered slightly after news of possible reserve releases spread. Even cryptocurrencies briefly moved, with global risk sentiment falling during panic and rising again as fears eased. This pattern shows how tightly connected modern financial systems have become. A missile strike near an oil facility can ripple through stock exchanges thousands of kilometers away within minutes. That speed makes communication between governments and markets more important than ever. Could better coordination reduce volatility? Perhaps, but only if the underlying conflict also moves toward resolution. Military planners in Washington and Tel Aviv reportedly believe their campaign could last 4 to 6 weeks if objectives are achieved quickly. Yet many independent analysts warn that wars rarely follow neat timelines, especially when regime change or major strategic shifts are involved. Iran still possesses missiles, regional allies, and asymmetric capabilities that allow continued resistance. Even limited harassment of shipping could keep insurance costs high and tanker traffic cautious, prolonging supply disruption. So the duration of the crisis remains one of the biggest unknowns facing policymakers. Another factor shaping the future is how other global powers react. China and Russia have publicly called for de-escalation while quietly increasing purchases of discounted oil where possible. Their response highlights how energy politics intersects with great power competition. Access to cheaper supplies during turmoil can provide economic advantages. Meanwhile, Europe and India, both large energy importers, watch developments nervously because sustained high prices would strain their economies and trade balances. This global web of interests means the war cannot be viewed only as a regional dispute. It is also part of a larger strategic chessboard affecting many nations. For ordinary people, however, the conflict often feels distant until prices begin changing at the pump or in grocery stores. Oil influences transportation, farming, manufacturing, and heating. When fuel costs rise, trucks become more expensive, flights cost more, and food distribution becomes pricier. That chain reaction is why economists worry about stagflation, a situation where prices rise while economic growth slows. Governments try to avoid that outcome because it can hurt jobs, savings, and political stability. This fear explains why the emergency reserve debate matters far beyond energy experts. It affects households, businesses, and entire national budgets across the globe. Looking ahead, technology and renewable energy could eventually reduce some of these vulnerabilities. Solar wind batteries and electric vehicles are expanding every year. If countries rely less on oil shipped through narrow choke points like the Strait of Hormuz, geopolitical leverage may weaken, yet that transition will take decades, not months. For now, tankers, pipelines, and refineries still form the backbone of the global energy system. That reality means conflicts in key producing regions continue to matter enormously. The current crisis therefore acts as a reminder of how interconnected energy security and geopolitics remain in the 21st century. So the final question viewers should ask is simple. Will this crisis fade quickly or become the moment that reshapes global energy politics for years to come? The answer depends on military outcomes, diplomatic signals, and economic decisions happening right now. If shipping resumes and reserves calm markets, the shock may pass. If fighting expands and Hormuz stays closed, the world could face a deeper energy storm. Either way, the events unfolding today show how fragile global systems can be when geopolitics and resources collide. The next headlines from the Middle East may decide not only the future of this war, but also the future of the global economy. Because when energy routes close, when oil becomes a weapon, and when major powers begin to clash directly, the consequences rarely stay inside one region. They spread across markets, across governments, and eventually into everyday life. So the real question now is not just who wins this conflict. The real question is this: will the world manage to contain this crisis? Or is this the moment the global energy order begins to change forever?